In this live press conference, streamings were made from Mexico City, from the city of Lima, and also from the University of Ica in Peru. In Mexico, Dr. Jose Zalce gave a brilliant presentation on the research that has been carried out, especially on the tridactyl bodies that were presented at the Mexican Congress. Very specific details that showed that these are authentic bodies. He also pointed out something very relevant. Documents issued by the government of Peru were presented where they recognized that these beings have DNA, and they recognized that they do not have the ability to read them. That is, they are recognizing that this is something that had life. So how can there be this inconsistency with the Ministry of Culture? Do you realize? On one hand, it is being investigated, and I must honestly admit, the government of Peru honestly issued these documents, which are far from what the Ministry of Culture has been exposing. It is very important that you notice this small detail. Let's go then with the presentation of Dr. Jose Zalce.
Good morning, everybody. It is an honor to be in this research since the beginning in 2017 and to have the privilege of knowing and studying these tridactyl bodies. I will give my testimony in Spanish for being proudly a Mexican scientist.
Good morning. Through this summary of the structural characteristics of these tridactyl bodies that are perfectly preserved in diatom powder in a state of conservation by desiccation, I will clearly explain their structural characteristics. As the first tridactyl, we have the one called Josefina, which has a head, thorax, abdomen, and limbs ending tridactylly. The most relevant thing about this tridactyl is that its skull is elongated and joins the neck centrally or medially through a cubic foramen magnum, which makes it unique. In its chest, it has a metal implant with exclusive characteristics of an alloy of osmium, cadmium, and silver at 95% purity, which is extremely rare in nature. These metals are used for satellite communication. However, they are attached to the chest of this specimen without causing a reaction or rejection in the tissue or skin. Likewise, we can observe the presence of eggs in 3 different sizes, which speaks of a different state of gestation. In this simple X-ray, we can observe the complete harmony and functionality between the bone joints, that is, the harmonious and natural continuity between one and the other. For greater definition, we have this tomographic image where in the skull we can see that there is still brain material inside. Furthermore, in this image, the spine can be perfectly highlighted throughout the entire body. And in the background, we can see the presence of the 3 eggs we are talking about, and on the surface, the metal implant perfectly attached to the surface of the skin. In this other tomographic image, we can see the head, neck, and thorax. In turn, we can see that the oral cavity is a kind of bird's beak that has a perfectly outlined swallowing duct, and that on the back of the vertebral bodies there is a duct that ends in the thoracic cavity just behind the implant, making some extraordinary details of this specimen. These images, these 4 images, are tomographic sections where we can highlight the presence of the eggs, the 3 eggs. However, the most relevant thing about this image is that we can identify a 4th egg of 1 millimeter in diameter that is inside this oviduct, which we can follow its path to the abdominal cavity where it will grow and develop. Inside this egg, we find an embryo, which is perfectly divided into a head, its developing eye, body, upper limbs, and the rest of the body. This image is extraordinary because it shows the natural evolution and development of an embryo which is practically impossible to replicate artificially if this were to be false. In the hands, the tridactyl relevance of these specimens allows us to show 4 phalanges in each finger, making them thin and very long, which can make a wrapping movement for support and not opposition. In these same structures, we can see the feet that are exactly the same as in the hand, tridactyls with 4 phalanges ending in the last phalanx in a claw position. Furthermore, in long bones, we can find this septum between the bones. This intraosseous septum allows the bones to have greater solidity and hardness without losing their lightness. They are very light, which favors their ability to move, their biomechanical capabilities. Our second tridactyl is Victoria. It is the only one that is in the sitting position and without a head. The head was lost due to a tearing effect. Multiple samples were taken from this body, which were to determine carbon-14, which, according to the Institute of Physics of the Autonomous University of Mexico, has an average of between 700 to 1,700 years old. Likewise, DNA samples were taken. The DNA gave spectacular results with a 30% difference with known species and 70% of species completely out of the ordinary. This was compared to 1 million species without finding a direct correlation. Likewise, tissue samples were taken which needed to be rehydrated in order to apply histopathological tests or analysis using a rehydration technique for these tissues known to the FBI. Our third tridactyl is Albert. The relevance of Albert is the long size of this neck. This size allows us to suspect that the head has an elongation and contraction movement with respect to the neck, as if it were a turtle. Our fourth tridactyl is Clara. Fluoroscopy studies were applied to this specimen that allows us to see in real time the movement of anatomical structures, such as in this image, where my hand moves over Clara's skeletal structure. In this image, we can see that the skeleton has a perfect fit in the joints, that there are no traces of assembly, and that there is no artifice that allows us to assume that it was artificially assembled. In this image, we can perfectly see the septum interosseous in the arm. This interosseous septum confirms that the bone is light but very rigid. We also have, as a tridactyl number 5, different loose hands of 45 centimeters in length as tridactyls. These hands are very interesting because we can find up to 6 phalanges in the fingers, making them extremely long. Likewise, we can find implants that have the same characteristics and elements as those previously mentioned. These hands could correspond to a larger specimen of more than 2.5 meters in height. Our sixth tridactyl is named Maria. This specimen has a bone structure very similar to that of a human. However, the bones are more robust, bringing it closer to the skeletal structure of a primate. In the skull, this skull is elongated and has a 30% greater capacity to contain neurological or brain material. The relevant thing about this specimen is that it is also tridactyl. In its hands, we can see up to 5 phalanges, and within these phalanges there may be a metatarsus or a metacarpus, which already allows a wrist joint that is much more similar to that of a human being. This tridactyl specimen has a claw ending on its last phalanx, where we were able to identify the presence of fingerprints in a linear manner. These linear fingerprints are unique in nature, since in primates or mammals, they are generally wavy and non-linear. Our seventh tridactyl is called Santiago. Santiago is a specimen smaller than Maria, but with very similar characteristics, also a tridactyl in which there are 3 phalanges on each finger. In this skull, we can see that it does not have bone consolidation and that it also has the presence of mixed dentition, that is, temporary teeth and permanent teeth that have not yet emerged. Our tridactyl number 8 was named Sebastián, in which you can see a plate on the back of the neck. This tridactyl is intermediate in size between Maria and Santiago. Its anatomical structure is very similar to that of a human, and the most relevant thing about this tomography is that organs can be seen inside. Its tridactylity can also be seen as having 4 phalanges in its hand. Inside the skull, this skull is perfectly ossified, and the content of neuronal material can still be seen, with the mixed dentition still pending, which makes it look like a young individual. In addition to this, we have loose pieces, hands and skulls, which allows us to suspect the existence of 3 to 4 species. Of these skulls, there are some that have metal implants, which have decorations or graphics. All of these bodies were requested from the government of Peru for recognition and study. Within the documents that were sent to the government of Peru, several responses were obtained. This document is, for me, the most valuable response because it determines that the public ministry, in its molecular biology and genetics unit, establishes that the nucleotide sequences of the 3 specimens recognize that the DNA samples that were taken are organic and biological. Second, it recognizes that it cannot make a statement on the matter since this DNA is non-human or different from human. Therefore, it also suggests that we go with professionals who know and can study other types of living organisms, thus recognizing that these bodies are organic matter and biological that need further study and that are not artifacts or crafts made by man. In conclusion, I want to confirm that, first, these bodies are 100% real, organic, functional, biological, and have an entire skeletal structure with no data of alteration or modification. Second, that these bodies may be a new species and that this species needs to be included in the phylogenetic line of Darwin's taxonomic tree. Third, if in Darwin's phylogenetic line we do not find its ancestors or its descendants, then we are facing the possibility of describing and accepting the presence of a species that is not recognized by science or what is known yet. Let's fight for their conservation that it allows us to achieve greater knowledge of these bodies. These tridactyl bodies need science to be able to study them in greater depth. Thanks a lot.
Muchísimas gracias.